First, in the last decade, Turkish investment in Ukraine increased fivefold, and there's a lot of Turkish businessmen who invest more and more in Ukraine. So why do Turks invest in Ukraine? What's so interesting here?
The total amount of Turkish investment in Ukraine is more than 2.6 billion US dollars, and 800 million US dollars of that sum has came from Turkey to Ukraine after 2014, after the Euromaidan revolution. As you know, Ukraine have the most pro-European, most pro-reformist government, parliament and president after 2014 in the history of independent Ukraine. And Turkish investors, Turkish companies have already noticed that change and the reform process, structural reforms process in Ukraine, and they continue to invest in the Ukraine and opportunities in Ukraine economy.
So what are the main sectors? Is it because Ukraine is known for its IT sector? It's also known, of course, historically for its agricultural sector. But where would you say?
Unlike in other countries, yes, Turkish investment in Ukraine are almost in every sector. So we can see in every sector of the economy, Turkish companies. Usually, Turkish companies are very successful abroad in such classical conventional sector like textile, construction, and food processing. But in Ukrainian case, in IT, in machinery, in food processing, shoe care products, telecommunication, medicine, almost in every sectors of in Ukraine economy, we have seen Turkish investment and Turkish companies. I can say more than 10 sectors or 10 product range we see in the first 3 places of the market. Turkish companies. So there is a diversification of Turkish investment in Ukraine, but mostly the investment are in telecommunication and construction. And over the recent 2 years, we have observed new investments, especially in renewable energy sector from Turkey to Ukraine. As I mentioned, the Turkish investment in Ukraine is after 2014, 800 million US dollars, and in that period, Turkey has become one of the top 3 foreign investor countries in Ukraine.
So you repeatedly talked about the revolution of dignity as a turning point for Turkish investors to come in Ukraine. Did you saw a lot of changes since that, and how do you see it?
It's maybe turning point, not just the number of the amount of Turkish investment, but after the revolution, there are some. Let's say there are some problems have occurred in Ukraine too. As you know, in Crimea, in Eastern Europe. So in some perceptions, Westerns or foreign countries, some Western countries, were not very aggressively to invest in Ukraine. But Turkish investors read the situation better than maybe them. So the presence of Turkish investments have become more visible. So every time Turkish investments were in Ukraine, because we are 2 neighbor countries, Black Sea connect Ukraine and Turkey together. But after 2014, as I mentioned, it became more visible. And we are in the golden age of Turkish-Ukraine political and economic relations. It is another factor. In 2011, started without visa regime between Turkey and Ukraine. And in 2016, since 2016, even Turkish and Ukrainian citizens can visit each other without international passports. Turkish citizens have such a right maybe with 4 countries, not more, and Ukrainians maybe 1-2 countries, not more. So it's a very important sign of the level of Turkish-Ukrainian business and economic and political relations, even that case.
So do you see that that kind of economic ties, that kind of investment can also be a factor of I won't say stability, but actually can help in the long run in a certain stability in the region, at least to help for sort of like Russia, let's say, won't touch too much of Ukraine because there are Turkish investors. Could it be a potential guarantee for Ukraine to stand its rank here?
Yes, stability is important, and countries like people. If you have prosperous, rich countries, rich neighbors in your neighborhood, it's always a plus for you. And if for Turkey a prosperous, a rich and strong Ukraine is a plus for Turkey, and vice versa. If as a neighbor, Turkey is a strong, prosperous and rich country. So I think the direction of Ukraine economy is very positive. We see every year stable growth. However, it is not enough as we want. But even the situation in Ukraine is a garant or trust for Turkish investors in the future in Ukraine.
So, for certain Western investors and certain businesses, Western businesses, investing in Ukraine, one of the obstacle here is sometimes the lack of guarantee towards a certain type of corruption, like security in businesses. I think it was 2 years ago the French, or 1 year ago, French ambassador complained about that kind of behavior sometimes. How to guarantee, and how can Turkey ask for Ukraine to guarantee the security of certain businesses and investment here?
You know, there are many countries in the world, and almost no country can give 100% guarantees. Turkey and Ukraine have many similarities. In 1995, when Turkey signed custom union agreements with EU, especially in 90s, we were like a situation which Ukraine has now. There was perception of high corruption in Turkey. There was perception of lack of rule of law in Turkey, and there were some political risks and geopolitical risks and conflicts in Ukraine for Western investors. And after the first 5-6 years signing custom union agreements with EU, Turkey couldn't attract enough investment from the Western countries because of all these perceptions or realities. It's related to which part of the glass do you see. And after 2000s, started to understand Turkish realities, and Turkey changed a little bit too in the process. And EU companies invested over the 15 years more than $100 billion to Turkish economy, and now 48% of Turkish exports goes to the EU. Same scenario we will see in Ukraine, but not now. So Western companies need some time. But for Turkish companies and for Turkish entrepreneurs, we have had such situation. So we have experience. Turkish companies, Turkish investors work in even more riskier areas than Ukraine. So we have experience. We understand better than our Western counterparts, Ukraine. So we trust that country. We believe in that country, and we continue to invest and make business here in Ukraine.
So according to your, as you said, your experience, and would you point out certain specific problems that maybe Ukraine has to overcome in, let's say, like maybe for the short term or medium term of 5-10 years to, become a really thriving economy around here?
Of course, I can say generally, and particularly for Turkish and Ukrainian relations, we should underline fight with the corruption is a key factor. Second important factor is to improve the situation with the rule of law. It's another factor. But another important factor is to improve the communication capacity of the Ukraine. Because sometimes the problems in Ukraine are exaggerated too. Ukraine is even better in some cases than other countries in the Eastern Europe, in some cases, or some aspects. But Ukraine cannot communicate with the investors enough. And it's not only to communicate with the words and with the actions. So Ukraine maybe altogether to show his citizens to some improvements in the country. If we speak not very concurrent results, if we speak only the Ukraine is a better country now than before 5 years ago, we should show some results.
Some figures.
So especially investing in infrastructure is a key factor in that case. We need in Ukraine better roads. We need in Ukraine better transportation facilities, transportation possibilities. It is very important, and it is very right decision of Ukrainian government now to open sky, for example, to liberalize the aviation and to attract more airline companies to the Ukrainian markets for Ukrainians and for foreigners for potential tourists to fly more. In Turkish case, it is a very important to sign a free trade agreement between Ukraine and Turkey. Turkish investors now are waiting for that agreement to invest more in Ukraine, especially for light industry. Now, in many cases, to produce now in Ukraine more attractive than produce in Turkey. But to move many Turkish factories, Turkish know-how and Turkish capital from Turkey to Ukraine, we need this free trade agreement, because all these companies need to export their products without customs to Ukraine, to Turkey back. Because Turkish market is 8-10 times bigger than Ukrainian market. So it is not only attractive to produce here in Ukraine and to export your products EU, Canada and other countries. You should export your finished products from Ukraine to Turkey too. So it's a very important thing for better Turkish-Ukrainian economic and business relations, Turkish-Ukrainian economic and business relations, signing free trade agreement between two countries as soon as possible. The negotiations start of that FTA in 2007, already past 12 years, and unfortunately it hasn't been signed yet. So it's a very important breakthrough factor for our relations.
So you said that the next fundamental step for that relation between Ukraine, at least economic relation between Ukraine and Turkey, would be this free trade agreement. But what's next? What could follow after that?
This free trade agreement will enable Turkish companies to invest more. I think, as an example, before Turkey and Egypt signed free trade agreements, Turkish investment in Egypt was $50 million, and in only 3 years it increased $2 billion. It became 40 times more. In Ukraine case, maybe not 40 times, for sure not 40 times more, but 3-4 times we will see more Turkish investment and Turkish know-how. It's very important because, as I mentioned, we have already 24 years experience to make foreign trade and investment between EU and Turkey. So it will be with its pluses and minuses very good experience for Ukraine.
And now, Ukraine, on the 31st of March, there is a important event for Ukraine, which is the presidential elections. And after that, there's going to be parliamentary elections. So it's an important year politically. For Ukraine, how to ensure that, as you said, these steps which have already been implemented between Turkey and Ukraine can continue that way, despite whoever is elected.
Ukraine is a serious country. I think Ukraine will follow anyway who will be president. Continue its way to the Western integration, to integrate the country with the world. At the start of 19th, there was 50 free trade agreements in the world. Now we have more than 280, and 1 billion people has exceeded over the recent 30 years the poverty line, thanks to this free trade agreement, free trade, and free market economy. And Ukraine has already decided politically and economically its way. So I think this process is irreversible. So Ukraine was a part of Europe and will be a part of Europe. Turkey is a part of Europe and will be a part of Europe. So we have very integrated, as I mentioned, economy with EU, Ukraine, Turkey. So altogether, I think all this process and this way make all these countries more prosperous through trade and investment.
So you would say you're quite optimistic about the future on this relation?
As I mentioned, of course, in some short periods, Ukraine can have problems, like everywhere. But Ukraine way is very positive, good direction. Maybe we can discuss the speed of that process or the speed of the growth. But anyway, Ukraine's future is very bright.
Well, thank you for this overview. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio today to talk about Turkish and Ukrainian relations. It was Burak Baliva, chairman of the International Turkish-Ukrainian Business Association. Thank you for watching the program and stay tuned for the rest.